Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we are finally beginning our coverage of Survivor 43 with my preseason power ranking. And coming into the season, I'm feeling pretty good about this cast, and I'm pretty excited for how the season will play out. And as I've usually done with other shows that I covered, it's now time to give my thoughts and first impressions of these players based on the information that we have so far. So there are 18 players on this season, and I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game, based on their bios, their interviews, and just how I feel about them as players. But let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 18, the player I believe is the least likely to win Survivor 43, based on everything we know right now, is Nneka. And I know plenty of people have been pretty low on Nneka so far from the preseason, and obviously based on our placement here, I largely agree with that sentiment. Now, the thing about Nneka is she obviously gives off this vibe of someone who wants to play a surreal-like game where she is an older woman, someone who appears to have gotten off the couch despite her actually having gone through quite a lot in her life. However, she also talks quite a bit in her interviews about how she wants to challenge the idea that people can resort to lying and cheating and backstabbing, where I kind of get where she's coming from, but it doesn't give me too much hope in her actually playing the strategic game. And yes, she does talk about wanting to build relationships with a lot of her tribe, but even then, I kind of see her as a bit of an outlier on this tribe here, where it is certainly possible for her to build bonds with certain people, but also could see her being an early boot, particularly if Vesey does end up going to tribal council early on. I could definitely see her being that easy target there. So while it's very possible I could end up being wrong here, particularly once the season actually starts, I feel like based on everything we know right now, I probably have the least confidence in Nneka to actually win the game, and I feel like there's enough early boot potential in her to leave her here at number 18. Now we're moving on to number 17, and we actually have someone who's very similar to Nneka in my personal opinion. I feel like this person also has a lot of potential to be an early boot, but at the same time, they do remind me a lot of a recent player that did relatively well. But here we have Morriah, and obviously the first impression I got was she is very similar to Marianne from Survivor 42. And in fact, Morriah herself talks about Marianne in her interview, saying that she's the non-winner she identifies with. Again, this interview was done before they knew that Marianne had won, so take that as you will. But obviously, I think Morriah will definitely be similar to Marianne in a lot of ways. I feel like she talks a lot about being this ball of energy that will use her positivity in order to boost morale and really draw people towards her. But I think the main thing that separates Morriah from Marianne is I don't have as much confidence in Morriah to play the game in a strategic way. Where even Marianne, I felt like she was someone who definitely talked a lot about being a fan, definitely someone who talked a lot about playing the game strategically, and we obviously ended up seeing that on the season. And even in that scenario, Marianne was not in the best position pre-merge, where, yeah, she does survive the Morriah vote, but had Taku gone to another tribal before the merge, I think Marianne would have been in a lot of trouble there. As for Morriah, I feel like she could still be in a similar position to a Marianne, except I don't have as much confidence in Morriah to navigate the strategic game compared to a Marianne. And plus, I feel like Baka is definitely poised to attend more tribals pre-merge than Taku was on 42. And I feel like in that position, that puts Morriah in a pretty bad spot to where she could end up being a relatively early boot, particularly with some of the people on her tribe that we'll be getting into later. So on the whole, I do feel like Morriah definitely could have some Marianne upside, and it's very possible that she could live up to that expectation that we saw from Marianne in 42. But on the face of it, I just don't have as much confidence in Morriah to be good strategically. And in general, I feel like she may not even get the opportunity to exercise her strategic capabilities and potentially be an early boot. So because of that, I do over here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have someone who's kind of similar here. And I actually have less faith in this person strategically than Morriah, but I do feel like this person has more longevity in them. But here we have Ryan. And the thing about Ryan is he definitely talks a lot in his interview about how he wants to be the provider for his tribe, how he wants to play a relatively honest game. although he does concede that he wants to lie at certain points, and he compares himself a lot to Rupert here. And I feel like Ryan is definitely going to be one of the more wholesome people on the cast. And while he does talk about like needing to play the game, I don't have as much confidence in him to actually do so. And I don't have as much confidence in him to take charge and lead with the actual plans here. Now, the thing about him, though, is I don't necessarily think he'll be an early boot. I feel like he'll be good enough physically in challenges. I mean, he is a personal trainer. So, through that, I feel like he will be kept around as an asset. And even outside of that, he definitely comes off as a pretty loyal guy. So, I feel like strategically, he'll at least be included as a number within his alliance here. But again, I feel like he will rarely take the forefront strategically to where I don't think he'll necessarily make some of the most optimal moves for his game. And I don't feel like he'll have that killer instinct needed to take charge and potentially take credit for some big moves, even if he were to make a deep run. So I feel like for those reasons, I can't have Ryan too much higher than here. But I will admit that I do like him a lot, and I do feel like he'll do relatively well longevity wise. But considering everything that we have, I don't feel like he'll be a particularly likely winner. So because of that, he is here at number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and we have someone who reminds me quite a bit of Ryan, but he definitely gave off more strategic content in his interview. But here we have Gio. And I feel like Gio and Ryan are kind of in a similar boat here, where I feel like they're both going to be good enough physically to where their tries will want to keep them around for a decent amount of the game. And at least in Gio's case, he definitely comes off as somewhat loyal to where I feel like he could fit in similar to Orion. But the thing about Gio is he obviously gives more strategic content in his interview compared to Ryan, to where I could see some upside for him making some big moves. But with that said, I also feel like he has a lot of potential to overplay as well. I mean, he talks a lot in his interviews about how he had to quit his job in order to play the game. He talks a lot about how he had a lot of insecurities growing up. And while he admits that he's not as cutthroat as a boss and Rob, he does want to play a big game nonetheless. So I feel like through those things, I feel like those are all things that can contribute to him overplaying. And if he does overplay, he could end up being an earlier boot. So while I think Geo is a bit more high variance than someone like Orion, I do feel like there's enough potential upside for him to navigate the game strategically, maybe be a bit more active and orchestrating certain moves to where I do have him a spot above Ryan. But at the end of the day, I'm not feeling too great about him on the offset. So he's here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and we have someone who is kind of similar to Geo in that I feel like they could be a bit high variance. However, this person does seem to be a bit more well-rounded, at least in terms of the aspects of the game. But here we have Noelle, and I'm a bit conflicted about Noelle, if I'm being perfectly honest, where she obviously seems to have a lot of like stuff there across all three aspects of the game. I mean, she should be good physically. I mean, she is a Paralympian. She's a big fan of the show, so I assume she at least has some strategic knowledge. And I think she could be okay socially. Although even then, I could definitely see her rubbing some people the wrong way. And I feel like that's a big reason why I don't have her too much higher on this list here, is that I feel like she kind of reminds me a bit of Sydney, in that I could definitely see her coming off as someone who can rub some people the wrong way, someone who can come off as a bit overconfident at points, although she's certainly not the only person that I feel that way about. And then there's also the fact that she has a prosthetic leg. Now, admittedly, I don't think this is going to be as big a knock against her as it was for, say, Kelly Bruno back in Nicaragua, or I guess to a smaller degree, Chad from Vanuatu. But I still feel like it could factor into like certain cases, particularly if she does make it somewhat deeper into the game. But I feel like that will not be the thing that drags her down. I could definitely see her going out pre-merge due to, again, her potentially rubbing some people the wrong way. But if she is able to make it to the merge, I could definitely see her getting into the majority group and from there on winning some challenges. I mean, she does talk about aligning with a lot of the bigger physical people, and I feel like she could find that in someone like a Cody, for instance. But aside from that, I feel like she kind of is an outlier on her tribe in that regard, and I feel like she could also very well be the shield that she wants to align with. So I'm not feeling too great about Noelle at the end of the day, and I feel like she definitely has quite a bit of potential to move up on this list, particularly once we see how she interacts on her tribe. But for now, I'm not feeling as great as certain other people, so I do have to leave her here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and we definitely have a pretty notable character to discuss here. But here we have Cody, and if I'm being perfectly honest, I don't have that much confidence that Cody will actually win the game towards the end, as he will probably come off as the leader figure right off the bat. Now, I know that he talks in his interview about how he doesn't want to be that leader figure, but I feel like he's going to become one nonetheless. And yes, while he does talk about playing a Malcolm style game, how he wants to court both the older and younger players, I still feel like he's going to be a massive shield for a lot of players there. He obviously gives this really questionable comment about how it's okay to make mistakes just as long as you're right 51% of the time, which, again, probably not the best way to approach the game, particularly when like one mistake can be the difference between you staying in the game and you going home. So I didn't really like that comment too much. And I feel like through that, he definitely has a pretty small trajectory at the end of the day. He is someone who will probably get towards the merge, but at that point will be cut, particularly once people no longer require him as a shield. So I'm not feeling too great about Cody overall. But with that said, I feel like he'll probably make the merge, I guess. But even then, I'm not feeling too great about him. The main reason I do have him this high, however, is I do think he could be in a good position through him being a leader, and I could see him potentially being in on some of the votes through that. But I'm not feeling great about him nonetheless, so he's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have another very interesting player to talk about here. And here we have Sami, the youngest player on the cast at just 19 years old. And I'm not feeling too great about Sami either. I feel like he definitely comes off as pretty confident in his interview, but he also gives some pretty questionable responses as well. I mean, his three words to describe himself are unpredictable, tenacious, and indecisive, which probably is not a very good combination. I mean, he says that he's too conversationally and emotionally experienced with people to be unaware of my standing in the game at all times, which screams out arrogance to a great degree. And he also talks a lot about how he'll do pretty well in the game, which obviously is not pretty good. And considering the fact that he is the youngest person on the cast, I mean, I feel like he could definitely be in for a rude awakening early on. I mean, I feel like he could definitely be on the outs early on. But the main reason I have him above certain other people is he definitely gives off some other answers in his interview that could open up the door for him learning as the game goes along. I mean, he talks a lot in his interview about how he's had a lot of insecurities from growing up, about how he was underestimated by others. And I feel like through that, he has this big chip on his shoulder that he wants to use in order to prove people wrong. And I feel like that could come through in his game. So when I look at Sami, I feel like he's someone who's definitely going to come in, try to do stuff early on, maybe overestimate how he'll stand with a lot of his tribe, but then be left on the outs for a vote or so. They're not actually going to target him, probably because he's good enough physically. And I think through that, he could definitely be on the bottom and have to scrape on by. I could definitely see him following a Xander like trajectory if we're like using 41, 42 people as examples here. I could definitely see him like being on the bottom early on, but then him sort of being humbled and moving up through the ranks through that. But the other factor to consider is the fact that he is so young, and that even if he does get towards the end, I'm not too sure that he will win a jury vote. I mean, again, if we are using the Xander example, I mean, he's someone who could get towards the end, but simply not have the respect there. And while he could definitely learn and try to get out the bottom through that way, I feel like that's definitely going to be a big obstacle for him actually winning the game at the end. So I know some people may peg him as an early boot per se, and someone who will probably remain this overconfident guy all the way through. I'm not necessarily on that boat. I could definitely see him being humbled and him trying to change course once things don't really work out for him. But at the end of the day, he is the youngest person on the cast. I feel like he'll definitely have some trouble integrating with certain people, particularly some of the older people on his tribe. And I feel like he will have a lot of trouble actually winning the game unless he plays his really massive game. But considering like the field here, I'm not feeling too great about his ability to do so on the offset. so I had to leave him here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and I feel like these next two are pretty similar in that I feel like they definitely have a lot of the tools there to make a deep run, but I also worry that they could end up being early boosts nonetheless, and through that high variance, I can't have them too much higher than here. But at number 11, I do have Jeanine here. And I know a lot of people love Jeanine a lot as she definitely is a fan of the show. She's someone who seems to have a lot there. And I can see a world where she does do relatively well. I think if she is able to find her foothold in the game, I could definitely see her making a pretty deep run here. But with that said, I do have several reservations with her. I mean, for one, she is a bit on the younger side. She is 24 years old. And while that isn't in itself a death sentence, I do feel like a lot of her answers come off as someone that doesn't have a ton of life experience. I mean, she definitely feels like someone who has spent a lot of her life in school. And yes, she does touch upon her background as coming from an immigrant family. But even so, I'm not getting the best sense that she'll be able to connect super well with some of the older players on her cast. So there's that. I was also underwhelmed by her accomplishment answer in her bio, and while it's good that she knows that she's an introvert and needs to recharge every so often, I mean, that doesn't give me the most confidence in her ability either. So I feel like through those things, she could definitely be an early boot. I feel like she is someone who fits the mold of someone who is good enough strategically, but is a bit on the younger side, and through that could be targeted. I mean, I could definitely see her being like a Sarah Wilson from 41, for example. But again, if she is able to find her foothold, if she's able to find her group of people, I could definitely see her doing pretty well. But with that downside, and again, along with her young age, I can't have her too much higher than here. So because of that, she is here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have someone who I feel kind of similar about to Jeanine, and here we have Cassidy. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I could very well see Cassidy being the first boot off her tribe, as she is someone who definitely could be seen as a bit of a physical weakness. And unlike someone that we'll be talking about soon, I feel somewhat less confident in Cassie's ability to integrate within this group. But with that said, I do decide to put Cassie a bit higher here, mainly because she is a couple years older. I mean, she is also a longtime super fan of the show, so there's that. She was actually cast to be on Survivor 41 before she was taken off the cast, so I feel like that's something at least. And I feel like through that, she could still be kind of underestimated. I mean, I feel like her and Jeanine feel pretty similar archetypes, if I'm being perfectly honest, which obviously comes with both upsides and downsides here. But again, the main reason I do have Cassidy a bit higher than Jeanine, despite her potentially being an earlier boot from her tribe, is aside from her age, I feel like she is on the tribe that will do better in challenges. I feel like Coco is less likely to go to tribal early on than Baka. So I think that could give Cassidy a bit more time to integrate socially within her tribe, but I'm still not feeling the best about her. So because of that, I do over here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have a pretty notable figure to talk about here. And here we have Mike, who will be going by Gabler here. And obviously Gabler was a pretty notable figure from the preseason. His audition tape was one of the first ones to be known about once the cast was leaked a couple months back. And through his bio and interview, he definitely gives off Brad vibes from Survivor 41. And he definitely has that potential to be a Brad figure, someone who, like is a bit on the older side, someone who is pretty good physically, but is also someone who may not have the best strategic reads in the world, may be a bit open to overplaying. However, if I'm being perfectly honest, I think he could probably be more like Mike Turner from Survivor 42, where he obviously is someone who could endear himself to a lot of people despite his tough exterior. And I do feel like he understands the game a bit better than someone like a Brad, although even then he definitely has some concerns there. He comes off as someone who likes players that play with a lot of intensity and enthusiasm. He says you don't need to win in order to be an inspiration, which are definitely red flags that do make me worried that he may not be playing the most optimally there. And he definitely talks about how he wants to align with someone who has heart and isn't just there to get to the end, which again is another red flag. And I definitely see the Brad comparisons there, and I'm not saying he can't be that, particularly if his tribe does end up going to a lot of tribals. However, on the offset, I do feel like he is someone who could connect with a lot of people and could end up in a good position. But with that said, I don't feel like he'll be that great of a strategic player. I feel like he is someone who, despite being able to connect with a wide range of people, will struggle to make optimal strategic moves, and through that could end up playing a Mike Turner style game. So while I do have a bit more confidence in his longevity than some people may claim off the preseason talk that I've heard, I don't feel like he's the best prime to actually win the game, and because of that, I do have him here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and I know a lot of people love this person. This person has kind of become a favorite to where a lot of people have them as their winner pick or a strong contender, and I do feel like this person has a lot of potential. However, coming into it, I do have some hesitation putting them too much higher, but here we have Karla. And again, I know a lot of people love Karla, and I actually like her quite a lot too. I feel like she has a decent background, going through a lot of adversity growing up. She identifies a lot with Sari, who I feel like she will have a similar trajectory to. And I feel like she is someone who, if she's able to find her footing, could make a deep run here. Now, where I do have some concerns is, one, I do feel like she can be a bit high variance. I feel like she is someone who could potentially be seen as a weakness early on, and if Coco were to go to Tribal, I could see her being targeted. Now, will she actually be the first boot? Probably not. I do feel like at the end of the day, while she may be targeted early on, I feel like she ultimately will find her footing, and through that, be able to find her allies and make a deep run. That's not so much the reason she's this low on the list. The main reason I have her this low on the list is I feel like she has a lot of potential to be targeted in the end game. I feel like, like aside from her being in some potential danger early on, I feel like if she were to get towards the end, she would emerge as this pretty blatant jury threat, someone that people would not feel super comfortable taking to the end. And I do feel like she may not be able to get out of that. I feel like she may struggle with threat management towards the end. And I'm not entirely sure she'll be able to win the challenges that she'll need to get through some of those rounds. So at the end of the day, I feel like there'll be some issues she'll have in terms of winning the game, both at the beginning, but more so at the end, that do lead me to not have her as high as she probably could have. But with that said, I do really like Karla. I feel like she will be a pretty effective player on the season. But given those concerns, I do have to leave her here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and I'm a bit surprised this person is as high as they are, as I don't actually have that much confidence in this person winning the game, but I feel like this person has less potential to be an early boot than the people we just talked about. But here we have Dwight from the Vessi tribe, and there's a number of concerns I have with Dwight. He is the youngest person on his tribe. He's one of the youngest people in this cast, actually. And through reading his bio, he definitely comes off as pretty similar to JD in a lot of ways. He talks about his accomplishments, how he's interviewed all these high profile people, all these politicians that kind of make him, like this wonderkin to a degree. And I feel like through that, he comes off as someone who, despite being on the younger side, could have some life experience there. But even then, I mean, I'm not that confident that he'll be able to connect super well with a lot of people. Kind of similar to Jeanine, he definitely seems like someone who spent a lot of his life in school and someone who seems pretty focused on academic accomplishments, even with a lot of the work that he's done, like interviewing all these public figures and stuff like that. And there beyond that, there's some other concerns as well. He says he doesn't compare himself to non-winners, which I do feel like is a bit arrogant at the end of the day, but it's not really enough to knock him too much. He says he wants to align with rational players to avoid going home due to someone else's mistake, which is a good enough answer. He says he's eager to look for advantages, saying that people seem to be afraid to target those with advantages, which isn't entirely true, so I do kind of worry in that regard. I do feel like he is a bit more aware of his limitations than someone like a JD, and I feel like he'll be good enough socially to where I don't think he'll be an early boot unless he really comes off as a bit snaky to a degree to certain people, or unless he struggles to actually connect with a lot of the older people on his tribe beyond just interview abilities. I do feel like his journalism background could help him get certain information, but I feel like this probably isn't the best cast for him. I feel like there's a number of older people on the cast that could probably take advantage of him. I feel like if they're given the opportunity, and while I don't feel like he'll be bad socially per se, I don't see him being that big of a player. I do feel like he has a lot of potential to be like some of the younger players we saw in 41 and 42, people like Eliana, for example, who makes a deep run and has some moves here and there, but probably doesn't have too much respect by the end of the game to be that big of a jury threat. And I do worry that Dwight could end up being a somewhat similar figure here. So at the end of the day, I don't feel that confident in Dwight actually winning the game. But considering I don't feel like he'll be as likely to be an early boot as some of the people we just talked about, I did have him a little bit higher here, but I'm still not pegging him as a winner candidate. He is here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we have someone who I think is fine on paper, and I feel like they definitely have a lot of potential, but I feel like I didn't get too much information from their preseason information. But here we have Justine, and I feel like Justine is kind of a more well-rounded version of certain other players we talked about earlier. I mean, similar to Karla, she is an immigrant, talks a lot about that in her bio. I feel like she also comes off as Jeanine, someone who is a bit on the younger side, but is also a couple years older, probably has a bit more life experience. And she definitely comes off as a relatively well-rounded player. I feel like she has an interesting combination of wanting to be resourceful while also using her background to connect with people. But with that said, I didn't get the best sense of how she'll do strategically from her interview. I mean, I assume she has the knowledge there, but I'll be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if she ended up being underwhelming in that regard. But in the absence of any true red flags, and plus the fact that she is on a relatively decent starting tribe, the Vessi tribe, I think she'll be all right. I wouldn't be that surprised if she ended up making the merge and from there was in a good position. But with the lack of additional information, I don't feel too comfortable putting her too much higher. So because of that, I have her here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5. And from this point on, I would consider this the top tier. I feel like these 5 players are the ones I feel the most confident about. And if I had to put money, I feel like the winner of the season will probably be one of these 5 players. But at number 5, the person I decided to go with here is Elie. And I definitely like Elie a lot. She seems to be at a good age. She's in the middle of the age among her Baka tribe. She compares herself to multiple strong players, but also has a decent awareness of each of their qualities as well. I feel like she's pretty well rounded and someone who will play very hard. And I feel like she will be a pretty big player on this season. Now, with that said, I do feel like there are some concerns there. I mean, she does talk about how she wants to play pretty aggressively, how she wants to look actively for advantages. She says how if she is given too much time to overthink, that she'll end up doing so, which, you could take that or leave it. I feel like she also has some potential to emerge as a pretty big threat later on in the game. Although, admittedly, I don't feel like she'll be the worst at threat management per se compared to some other people we'll be talking about soon. But I feel like those are plenty of concerns that I have for her coming to the season. But with that said, I still feel like she'd be a pretty effective player. I wouldn't be that surprised if she ended up doing pretty well in the season. But with those concerns, I did decide to leave her here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and we have someone who is kind of similar to Elie, only the issues I have with him are even more magnified. But here we have Owen. And obviously, Owen is another preseason favorite. He's definitely one of the more likable people. Definitely gives a lot of strong answers. He's pretty well rounded as a whole. Good socially, good strategically, good physically. And that last part is particularly key as he definitely talks about how people won't expect him to be that good physically when in fact he is pretty athletic and is someone who will probably be a biggest surprise come challenge time. So I feel like those are all things that work out in his favor. I would be very shocked if he went out pre-merge. And I feel like he is set up pretty well in this tribe. I feel like he has a lot of potential to connect with a lot of people on the Baka tribe. And I feel like beyond that, he'll be a pretty big player on this season. But with that said, I feel like he is very similar to what we saw with Omer from 42 and from Ricard in 41, where he seemed to be this pretty perfect candidate on paper, gave all the right answers in the preseason, and during the season, he seemed to be a pretty big factor in the season, seemed to be a pretty big character, but was ultimately taken out in the end game due to them being a big threat. And I feel like Owen has a lot of potential to end up in that position to where people recognize that he's playing this big game and will probably be taken out as a result. So I feel like that alone will probably knock him down a bit on my contention here. And I feel like even if he gets a big edit early on, I feel like that'll probably be a concern in that he'll probably be set up on a similar trajectory to like an Omer and a Ricard from the last two seasons. But with all that said, I do still feel pretty confident about him. He seems to have a lot there. He's a pretty big fan, pretty knowledgeable, and is someone who I feel like will do pretty well in the season. So because of that, I do have him here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and at one point, I actually had this person as my winner pick. I really liked this person. I felt very confident about them, and even now, I still feel pretty good about them. I mean, hence why they are this high on the list. However, after thinking about some more, I did decide to bump them down a bit. But here we have Jesse. And I love Jesse a lot. He has a very interesting story with a rough upbringing, talks about being in a gang, but then turned his life around and became like a very academic based person, getting a PhD. And obviously, this reminds me a lot of Shan from 41, someone who had a very similar background. And I feel like that will definitely lead to Jesse doing pretty well here. He has the life experience to be able to connect with a broad range of people. He knows how to talk to a broad range of people as well, which I think will serve him pretty well here. I think he also has a pretty good tribe here, like the Vessi tribe, which probably isn't going to go to a lot of tribals pre-merge, but even outside that, I feel like he'll be able to connect with a decent amount of people there. I feel like he'll be a connective tissue between a lot of people within his tribe, to where I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up being the leader of the Vessi tribe for a lot of it. And reading his interview as well, he definitely talks about how he got back into the show during Ghost Island, despite watching it when he was pretty young, has become a pretty big super fan, and obviously that knowledge is going to help him pretty well here. And he obviously picked Shan as his non-winner as well, which I do feel like is pretty apt as well. So I definitely love Jesse a lot. He definitely has the life experience and the skill set that I feel like would translate to him doing well on Survivor. But after thinking about some more, I did decide to bump down. Well, because one, we did see Shan like be a pretty big player in the season, only for her to be taken out the final 8. I wouldn't be surprised if Jesse followed that similar trajectory. And the other thing is a bit more weird, but I have been seeing some of the commercials for Survivor, like through watching football and stuff like that. Like we have started getting commercials for 43, and Jesse was pretty prominently featured in those commercials. Like there was literally one commercial that literally went through the story of how he was a part of a gang and then turned his life around. So I feel like through that, that does make me a little bit concerned that maybe he's not the winner, as I don't feel like they would promote him that heavily if he were actually going to win the season. I feel like that little tidbit there was enough to knock him down a little bit for me, but I still feel very confident in Jesse, and I feel like he will still do pretty well in the season. But I decided to leave him off the very top of the list. So because of that, I have him here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and I feel like it was a debate for me between these top 2. And to be fair, I feel like one of these people definitely has a bit more risk involved in their win equity, while the other person does seem on paper to be a bit more safe, even if they also have some concerns. But at number 2, I did decide to go with the less risky option here, and I decided to go with James. And I really like James as well. I feel like he definitely gives off a good vibe off the bat. He's a pretty good age. He describes himself as confident, casual, and self-aware. He has a chess background, which I assume would lead to him being pretty good strategically. Although even then, I mean, we've never actually seen a chess player win Survivor, so take that as you will. I mean, he definitely connects a lot with Earl Cole, which I do feel like is a pretty apt comparison. I could definitely see him being that type of figure, someone who comes off as pretty calm for the most part, but also someone who commands a lot of respect. But with that said, he also talks about being a pretty aggressive player. I mean, he says that he has the potential to be like a Russell, which probably is a red flag, if I'm being perfectly honest, so take that as you will. But I do feel like James is a pretty well-rounded player. I feel like he is someone who definitely has all the skill sets there to connect well with his tribe, but also someone who probably doesn't have the downside of someone like an Owen, in that I feel like there'll be a massive threat in the end game. I feel like James could reasonably skate on by through the end game, even if he is someone who makes a lot of big moves there. So I feel like that is a big reason I have him as high as he is. I feel like he's someone who can remain under the radar while still like connecting with people and laying the groundwork to build a good game for himself. But the main reason I don't have him at number 1 is I do feel like there are enough red flags there, like the fact that he is someone who plays chess, someone who, again, mentioned Russell in his interview. I do worry that could lead to him treating people like chess pieces. I feel like that could lead to him maybe not having the best jury management in the world. And I feel like that was enough to leave him outside the number one spot here. But I still feel pretty good about James. I'd be very surprised if he was a pre-merge boot. And because of that, I have him here at number 2. And now, at number 1, my winner pick for Survivor 43 is Lindsay. And I know this seems like a riskier option off the offset, as there's obviously the big red flag with Lindsay in that she is an older woman. And we have seen like players like her before, like particularly a Chrissy from HHH, someone who was able to play a pretty effective game for the most part, a pretty aggressive game, but through them being an older woman, they had a hard time garnering respect as people saw them as this mother figure. And when she ultimately did stuff that went against that, people got very upset at her to the point where they didn't have too much respect for the game that she was playing. And even going by more recent history, we obviously saw Tiffany and Heather, again, two older women, both play on 41, and yet neither of them exactly panned out, with Tiffany being someone who was taken out early after the merge, and Heather is someone who got to the end of the game in a spot where they weren't really seen as that big of a player, but believe it or not, could have actually won, but that's besides the point. The point is, it seems like based purely off archetype, Lindsay doesn't seem super set up well here. I mean, she is the oldest on her tribe, one of the oldest women on her cast, and obviously those aren't things working in her favor. But I feel like Lindsay has a lot of potential to work around a lot of those issues. I mean, for one, she is a massive super fan of the show. I mean, obviously, we know that Tiffany and Heather, obviously Chrissy, they were obviously fans of the show, but I feel like Lindsay is a different type of fan than them. She is an outright super fan. She literally talks about like playing in fantasy pools and stuff like that. She seems someone who is extremely knowledgeable about the show, and I feel like through that is pretty primed to play a pretty active strategic game. I also feel like she's pretty good physically, pretty good socially, definitely has all the stuff there. She talks about in her interview about the thing that I just mentioned of how older women have historically gotten to the end only to lose. She really wants to buck that trend. And to her credit, I feel like she has a lot of potential to do so. I feel like people are becoming more aware of this fact. And I feel like that definitely opens up the door for someone like a Lindsay to get away with playing a more active game and for people to potentially gain some respect for her. So I feel like there's that. I also feel like she has a number of people she can connect with on her starting tribe, the Coco tribe. And I don't really see her being an early boot from her tribe. I feel like there are definitely other people who have more potential to be an early boot than her. And I feel like she is obviously someone who doesn't have the same threat management issue that I feel like other people will have, people like an Owen, for example. I feel like she is someone who could navigate through the game pretty effectively. And I would be surprised if she became the threat over someone like an Owen later on in the game. So there's that. So I definitely have a lot of confidence in Lindsay coming into the season. And I know that I am taking a bit of a risk here. I am taking a leap of faith by making her my winner pick. But I just feel like she is someone who has a lot of potential to break this trend, to play this type of game and actually gain the respect to win as an older woman. So I feel like because of that, I feel like Lindsay is someone who I feel like can do pretty well. She is someone that I really like. And for those reasons that I have her as my winner pick for Survivor 43. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, obviously, once the season starts, I'll be doing weekly power rankings for Survivor 43, updating my thoughts as we actually see the game play out, so stay tuned for that. Big Brother 24 is wrapping up soon, so I'll be doing some postseason coverage for that once that happens, so there's that. Amazing Race 34 will be airing alongside Survivor 43. Yeah, that'll be fun, but I'll be doing content for that as well. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server. I'll leave a link to join in the description. A lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that's the video. See ya.